Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this is the SeeAudio Cross Crinacle Yume Midnight. If you don't believe me, there you go. There it is on the box. That is the full name of this IEM, but we're not going to hold it against it. In fact, from now on, we'll just call it the Midnight. Let me pull this thing up here in front of my face so we can talk about it. So the Midnight, this is Crinacle's latest IEM. And if you're not familiar with who Crinacle is, he's an IEM reviewer, also now on YouTube. Check him out. I should link to him in the description down below. But yeah, he's an IEM reviewer that's actually gotten into tuning IEMs in collaboration with manufacturers of IEMs. And the Yume Midnight is his latest collaboration. This one came out in the beginning of January, and since then I've been spending a number of weeks living with the Yume Midnight, comparing it to some other IEMs, including his other IEMs, but mostly today what we're going to be talking about is the Yume versus some other IEMs in this price range. And so the price range here is, this is a $200 earphone, and it's a hybrid earphone. You got two balanced armatures, a single dynamic driver for the low end, and that's about the gist of it. I mean, this is based on the original Yume, as you might expect from the name, that came out, I think, back in 2021. And that was kind of a lean, somewhat boring, neutral tune. Here, Crinacle's added a little bit of extra spiciness and added a little bit of extra flavor to it, which we'll talk about in a bit. But yeah, that's the Yume Midnight in a nutshell. Of course, what we're going to do today is give a review of the Midnight. And like all my other reviews, this is a live stream. So if you're here now watching live and you have any questions about the Midnight or anything else that we talk about, please do leave it in the live chat. And at the end of the review, we'll get through the review, we'll talk about the sound, we'll talk about the build quality. At the end of the review, stick around and we'll have a little bit of a conversation, hopefully answer any questions that you might have about the Midnight. But I guess otherwise, what do I want to say? I mean, shout out to Hi-Fi Go for sending this in for review. We do have a link to them in the description down below. Otherwise, let's jump to the table and start talking about build. And we'll start like I normally do by actually just talking about what comes inside the box. And I already gave you a preview of the box itself. If you missed the initial unboxing, we'll do sort of the quick run of it here while I roadie wrap the Midnight, place it here in the table for you to behold. So what you get with the Midnight is this stuff, and it's pretty straightforward accessory package. Actually, there's some stuff that's in the box I didn't take out, like some stickers and some other nice little fan service paraphernalia. I appreciate that SeeAudio includes that with their IEMs, but otherwise what you get is a fairly standard case here. It's a bit of a hard shell on it, and yeah, I don't know. I think as far as carry cases go, this is a pretty decent design because this will slip into a backpack, even slip into your back pocket. It's thin enough, maybe not the most comfortable in your back pocket, but frankly, not too bad. So pretty happy with that case. And then of course you get a selection of ear tips, including, they actually come in 5 different sizes, which is a little bit unique. These ear tips, I would say, are pretty average, typical ear tips. They've got, you know, a decent level of stretch to them. They're not, I don't know, they've got some grip to them. They're not entirely, what do we want to say, kind of chalky as some earphone tips can be. So those are pretty decent, but you might notice I'm not using those, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But otherwise, you also get a set of replaceable filters, which is interesting. This is becoming a little bit more common, earphones, because they go inside your ear. They might get gross, they might get gunked up, and you might not have a way to deal with it, except that companies are starting to include replacement filters in them. Not that interesting. But what is a little bit more interesting is the earphone itself. So let's go ahead and talk about this, starting with the cable that it comes on. I'll say, in general, I think this is a pretty decent little cable. It's very handsome, simple, bare bones. It's a little bit on the thin side, which does not bother me at all. I would say my biggest issues with this cable, if I was getting really picky about it, is a little bit on the stiff side, a little bit on the springy side. You might have noticed that during my initial unboxing. I was actually having some issues getting it to roadie wrap and stay in place, but then you might also notice how well it roadie wraps and stays in place now. And that was just me using a little bit of a hairdryer magic to tame the cable. It's still, again, a little bit on the stiff side, but honestly, for the most part, pretty happy with this cable. The one exception I will mention, and you might have noticed me playing with this a little bit earlier, The cable comes with this, which is, well, I'll zoom in on that so you can see this piece of plastic in all its glory. This is a chin slider, and this is one of the most useless chin sliders I've ever seen in my life. And it basically just slides up and down around the cable without staying in place, and it annoyed me enough that I actually chopped it off, so it's sitting over there for now. You don't need a chin slider, but if you do like a chin slider, I applied just like a little simple silicone O-ring. I use those pretty often, and that works well for me. But otherwise, I don't know. I like it's got a nice straight jack. It's nice and simple. And otherwise, again, a really just kind of bare bones, but nice cable. I would say not a premium feeling cable, but honestly, no real complaints about it. That brings us now to the earpieces themselves. And let's punch in these. While we start to talk about, I'm frankly kind of surprised that this is such a, we'll say, polarizing aesthetic. Frankly, I think the SeeAudio Yume Midnight is a pretty attractive looking earphone. Some people apparently don't really love the carbon fiber look, but I think it looks pretty handsome, and it does, I don't know, from what I can tell, it's even like actually carbon fiber, if that matters to you. I know sometimes fake carbon fiber can be a bit of a turnoff, although I don't know, I'm not going to be too picky about that when we're talking about earphones. But yeah, I think it's pretty handsome look. The only complaint I would really give about the aesthetics is that I think the word midnight is printed a little bit large here on the right earpiece. On the left earpiece, you just have the SeeAudio logo, and that's generally pretty handsome. The pieces are basically all black. I think they are somewhat semi-translucent, but it's probably not going to show up here on camera. And really, there's not much to see inside of the earphone because of how dark the plastic is on it. Not a problem, but I don't know, if you're into seeing the insides, this one will leave you a little bit disappointed. One thing I think that was worth pointing out, though, is that these shells actually fit a little bit larger than they look. I don't know, I think these look like a pretty small shell, and even in the hand, they feel pretty small. They're fairly lightweight, but when it comes to actually fitting them, and I guess I'll do a little bit of a fit demonstration for you now, they do actually fit somewhat on the large side. So let me punch it on that so you can kind of see how that fills up my conchal. And, you know, I wouldn't say it's necessarily super large in sort of the outer concha area, but it's more in kind of down here where it fits into my ear. And part of that might be from a somewhat longer than average stem, which was also the case with the original Yume. Although the original Yume surprisingly had a pretty different design than this one, or in entirely different construction. But it is interesting that that seems to be pretty similar. So you do have a somewhat long stem. And I mentioned a bit ago that I actually swapped on different ear tips here. These are Moondrop's spring tips. And the reason that I've switched to these ear tips is that these allow the earphone to fit better for me. Let's see if I can maybe actually demonstrate this. Let me pull out the smallest ear tip that they've got stock and kind of just demonstrate that the stock ear tips, you can kind of see it sticks out just a couple millimeters further. And because of that, if I wear this thing stock with this ear tip, the earphone itself kind of sits outside of my ear. Maybe I'll demonstrate that as well. This is with the spring tip, but you can imagine, punch in on that. This is with the spring tip. It allows it to fit pretty well, and I get a nice deep fit with it. But with the stock tips, it ends up fitting a little bit further outside of my ear and just kind of hanging out here, which, I don't know, it's not a big deal, but I preferred the fit with the spring tip, so that's why I've got spring tips on it, in case you were wondering. Yeah, if you have that issue yourself, or you like an earphone to fit a little bit deeper, something like the spring tips are good because they're a little bit shorter than average, your average ear tip, and it allows it to fit a little bit better. Now, while we're on the topic of fit and these tips, I got to bring up actually a pretty important point that it's a big part of why, and maybe entirely the reason why. This review is happening a little bit later than you might have expected. So I've had the Midnight for, I mentioned, a couple of weeks, probably almost a month now at this point, maybe even longer than a month. Wow, it's been a while. The first unit that I got, I had an issue with it, right? And I think I even mentioned this a little bit when I was doing the unboxing and I was doing the fit test, is I noticed that it has a vent on it. It is a vented design, but when I fit the first unit into my ears and got a deep fit, there was this really uncomfortable pressure buildup in there. And maybe more to the point than the fact that it was somewhat uncomfortable, because I can break the seal a little bit, but that pressure buildup was doing weird things with the dynamic driver. I was having issues with basically the bass would just kind of get cut out if I fit this thing deep into my ear the way that it feels like it should be fitting with the stock units. So I raised that issue with Hi-Fi Go just to see, like, is this a normal thing? And because I'd love to be able to tell people if this is a normal thing, but if it's a thing that's not normal, I'd also love to be able to tell people that. So they actually sent me a second unit, and that's what's taken so long for me to review this. And what we're looking at here is actually the second Midnight unit that I've received. And I will say that the sealing issue is less of a problem here on the second unit, but it is still here, and it is still an issue with this unit. And that sealing issue, again, it's more than just like a bit of a comfort issue, because it's more than just a bit of a comfort issue. It really does like affect the sound dramatically to a point where with the initial unit, it was actually pretty annoying to every time I would put it in my ears, I would have to spend quite a bit of time trying to balance out the pressure by like lifting my ear, letting air, I suppose, back into it. And yeah, I don't know, it was pretty fiddly to fit because of that. Now, the second unit that I've got here, less fiddly, but it still can be a bit of a problem. I found that it was more of a problem actually with the spring tips. So some of that now is self-inflicted, but I was able to reproduce the problem with the stock tips, provided I got a good seal, which again was harder for me. But there's a long way of saying these things fit pretty securely, but they are a little bit fiddly to fit inside of the ear, and because of that seal issue can be a little bit uncomfortable. So ergonomics on the Yume Midnight, I would say, are just so-so. So there you go for what it's worth. And I think that's about as much as I wanted to say about the physical stuff. Let me just check my notes to make sure I'm not missing anything. I am not missing anything. So let's go ahead and dive into and talk about the sound signature here on the Yume Midnight. And I mentioned that the Midnight is based on an original Yume that came out last year. That sound signature was very much, I think you could just call it straight up neutral. Like, it had maybe a bit of a sub bass boost, but it was basically straight up neutral sound signature. So what did Crinacle do to the Midnight? He's the tuner. What are the changes that he made? Well, this is actually pretty significantly different, frankly, versus the original Midnight. Here what we've got, I would say, is a very sub bassy set. This is somewhat of a warm, laid back, bassy set. But the bass is pretty well isolated into the sub bass frequencies, although it's not entirely, which we'll talk about a little bit. So I would describe this as a wub bassy set. If you're into that wub in your music, the Midnight is definitely going to be a set that will satisfy you, versus the original Yume definitely would not. That much I think is pretty obvious from the frequency response if you're taking a look at that. The other thing that's pretty obvious from the frequency response is that the treble extension here on the Yume Midnight is not just improved over the treble extension on the original Yume. It's actually really quite well extended, which is not a thing you can say for a lot of earphones, especially under 200 bucks. Usually when you're looking at earphones with nice treble extension, you're probably looking at something that's costing $500 plus, like for real. So actually pretty impressive there. The stuff that's not maybe so obvious from the frequency response graph is that the vocals I would describe on this thing as being somewhat laid back. They're not like totally recessed vocals, but I think that the vocal presentation here definitely does take a backseat to that bass, and it gives it that kind of warm, laid back character with again, the bass, I would say, is definitely sub-bass focused, but it's not lean. It's still got a bit of meat to it, and it gives it kind of this richness. I think it's also maybe worth comparing this a little bit. This is going to be kind of the only area where I'm going to compare this to the Moondrop Dusk, which was Crinacle's other IEM that came out last year. Just because I think a lot of people are seeing this as potentially a lower cost Dusk. I gotta be just upfront, this is not a Dusk, in my opinion. The tuning is quite different here. And you can see in a frequency response there's some similarities, like the similarities are they're roughly neutral-ish mid-range and sub-bass boost, but honestly here on the Midnight, well, let's say the Dusk. I would say the Dusk is just a much more mid-range focused sound signature. The vocals are a lot more forward in the mix. And I would say the lower mid-range on the Dusk is a little bit lean, kind of giving the Dusk somewhat of a clinical sound, but still bassy. Whereas here, again, I would say this is a little bit more on the rich bassy side, with the vocals pulled back quite a bit. So, versus the Dusk, I would say the Midnight is something entirely different. And if that's to your liking, well, that's a good thing, right? So let's go ahead and talk about what I like about the sound here on the Midnight. And generally, you know, I'm not necessarily the biggest bass guy, but I'm also not, let's be real, I'm not a bass hater. The bass here is quite good. Sorry, I'm struggling with something on my computer real quick. Hold on. All right. Something on my computer is freezing, so I'm gonna have to freestyle this. What I like about it is the bass is quite well done here. It is, again, quite focused in the sub bass frequencies. Gives you a bit of meat to it, which I quite appreciate. And generally it's got like a decent bit of texture to it. Like it digs pretty deep. If you're into that. And sorry, I'm pulling up my notes to make sure I don't miss anything. Yeah, just generally the bass is quite clean. It's pretty well separated from the lower mid-range, although again, it does have a bit more fullness versus something like the Dusk, which is almost entirely sub-bass focused. It doesn't really feel bloated at all, which I like. Again, it also doesn't feel anemic. It's got a decent body to it. The treble extension is the other thing here on the Midnight that I quite enjoy. What that tends to do, and it depends really on the music that you're listening to, but if you're listening to music that has a lot of like, you know, cymbals, hi-hats and stuff like that, the treble extension isn't necessarily like a fundamental part of those sounds, but having that present extended treble seems to contribute to a bit more of a lifelike character to cymbals and stuff like that. It oddly enough, even though it's like really high frequency stuff, it actually seems to give them a sense of body that you might not get in a set that rolls off sooner. And frankly, that's most sets. Most sets will roll off sooner than the treble here. And I quite like that. And I think from that sense of, from that treble extension plus that bass presence, that sub bass presence, you get a pretty nice sense of depth from the Yume. Not necessarily, I would say this is not, you know, a really wide sounding set, but you do get a nice sense of depth. So that's what I like here on the Yume. What are the things maybe I don't love about it? All right, and there are some things, right? This is worth talking about. First of all, we'll start just by alluding to the frequency response graph, which I don't usually bring up too much in reviews, but there's been some concern. There is a fairly significant 8K peak in the frequency response of the Midnight. It shows up in my graph, it shows up in some other graphs as well. And I've seen some concerns about it. In fact, I think SeeAudio even like made a social media post trying to downplay it a little bit. Here's what I will say. I don't think that the treble here is especially spiky or anything like that. I would say that it's, you know, behavior with sibilance is not bad. It's not especially sibilant set or anything like that. And if saying it's not especially sibilant sounds like damning with faint praise, sibilance is mostly just baked into music. And there are some sets that deal with it really well, some sets that deal with it really poorly. And then there's most sets in the middle. And I would say the Midnight, frankly, is most sets in the middle. So it's not an especially sibilant set, although S sounds can sound a little bit wet, I would say, here with the Midnight. It's kind of an effect I got, and maybe that's attributable to that 8K peak. But there you go. That was my kind of experience with that. I think for me, though, the bigger issue that I have with the Yume Midnight is maybe a side effect of the tuning, but also maybe just a side effect of something else with the driver configuration. It's just that I found that the mid-range on the Midnight, frankly, it lacks texture. Like, I just found it a little bit overly smoothed over. Vocals, right? What I like on vocals is you get sort of a sense of texture, a little bit of micro contrast, and sort of maybe just a bit of like breathiness and edge to them. Whereas here on the Midnight, I think it lacks that a little bit. And because of that, you know, again, the vocals are somewhat pulled back on this. But I wonder more if it has to do with the balance of bass to lower treble, which is a little bit relaxed here on the Midnight. Now, what's interesting, I mentioned that Hi-Fi Go actually sent me 2 different units of this, and if you're curious in comparing the frequency response graphs, I have both of them up on squig.link. There should be a link in the description down below. Interestingly, the lower treble presence, there's actually a little bit more here on this second unit. And so that character to the mid-range being somewhat smoothed over and lacking texture, while I would say that this second copy of the Midnight doesn't solve it entirely, I would say it's actually noticeably better. And just looking at the frequency responses, there is a little bit extra lower treble presence on this unit. Maybe that's related, maybe it's related to the seal issue. I'm not entirely certain, but what I can say is I've tried 2 of these units. One of these, frankly, I find the mid-range just really pretty disappointing and lacking. And then the second unit, I would say the mid-range it's fine. It's definitely not its standout quality here. So yeah, I don't know, that's kind of the gist of it in terms of the general sound signature. So and kind of what I like and what I don't like. Let me throw these accessories to the side and pull out some other earphones in the price range so we can kind of put it into context of what else is out there. And let's move that to the side. So we've got our SeeAudio Crinacle Yume Midnight. We're also going to compare it to the Moondrop Kato. This is an earphone that came out late last year. Also going to compare it to the FiO FH3. This is actually a bit of an older unit, but because of this sub-bass tuning, it's also a hybrid with a similar driver configuration. I thought it was actually worth bringing up. And then also just because it's, again, similar price range, also a hybrid, bringing the SeeAudio Legacy 4. So these are our competitors, right? So a quick breakdown on the price. Again, hybrid unit, 2 balanced armatures, 1 dynamic driver, $200. The Moondrop Kato is a single dynamic driver set, around $190, I do believe. Let me check my notes, make sure that's right. That is right. The FiO FH3, by far the cheapest one here on the table. This is $130, and it's also a hybrid, 2 balanced armatures plus 1 dynamic driver. And then finally, we've got the SeeAudio Legacy 4. Also a hybrid, I think around $190, $95, something like that. And this is a 3 balanced armature set with a single dynamic driver. So I'm going to compare these things in a couple of different categories, and I'm going to attempt to rank them while I do it. And we'll start by just talking about how these things compare tonally, right? We're just talking purely about the tuning. And I definitely have my preferences, right? If you watch my channel, you know I tend to prefer a neutral sound signature. And if it's going to be neutral, I tend to prefer a little bit on the bright side. Bass is not necessarily my emphasis or my priority. So take these rankings with, we'll say a grain of salt, but take these rankings with that in mind. If bass is your priority, your ranking might differ, and that's totally fine. But how I would rank these just purely in terms of frequency response is I think I would actually probably put the Legacy 4 up top, the FiO FH3 here, the Kato there, and frankly, I'll probably put the Midnight in last in terms of, again, we're just talking about my preferences. So how these things actually stack up, what's different about them. For starters, the SeeAudio Legacy 4. I mentioned I prefer a neutral tune. This is the most neutral of the bunch. It might also be the most boring of the bunch. Again, if you're looking for bass, I would say this has the least bass presence of the bunch here. But it is, again, for my taste, it's the most mid-range focus of it. It is a little bit on the bright side. It's got a little bit of, maybe a little bit too much presence in the lower treble. I wouldn't say it's fatiguing at all, really, but it does take away from the 100% natural tonality, but generally pretty good here on the tuning. And there is some sub-bass focus, sub-bass boost, so you do get that, and it's pretty nice. I don't know, the bass is not lacking on it, but if you're looking for a bassy set, that one might disappoint you. For me, I actually like it the best though. Next up, I would say is actually the FiO FH3, which is an interesting set because This, I would say, is also still a pretty mid-range focused tune, but you also still get just heaps and gobs of sub bass. Like the bass tuning on this, I reviewed this, let's see, it was probably back in 2020. So yeah, it was well over a year ago, about a year and a half ago. And I was really impressed with it at the time. It was just like way more bass than I'm usually used to, but the tuning of it, they actually did it really well. And in listening, going back to it and comparing it with these sets, like I still really quite like the FH3. Again, you still get a very, very mid-range focused tune, maybe a little bit low on contrast in the mid-range, but pretty good. And then they've managed to do it while still giving you just, again, heaps and gobs of sub bass. I would say this is not necessarily the meatiest mid bass or anything like that, but I don't know. I think the balance is just actually it's pretty well. Next up, I would say, is the Moondrop Kato. This I would describe as kind of a mild V-shaped sound signature. Probably the most traditionally tuned of the bunch here, and it's very, very well done, especially for a single dynamic driver. Here you get, I would say, the meatiest bass of the bunch, right? So all of these have bass boost to some degree. Most of them are sub bass focused. This one actually has some mid bass boost to it. So that gives it, I don't know, probably the most body in the bass. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the technicality section. But just overall, I would say just generally a clean, contrasty sound signature that is pretty complementary to generally most music. And then finally here we have the Yume Midnight, which again, I just kind of already just spent a lot of time talking about what this thing sounds like, but versus this bunch, I would say the vocals are probably the most relaxed on here. You do get that really nice treble extension, that 10K plus treble extension, which I don't think any of these really match. And then that sub bass boost is, I would say, probably a little bit less sub bass boost versus here, but maybe a little bit more mid bass than the FH3. So maybe it's a little bit meatier in the bass versus the FH3. And that's kind of how those stack up. Now, let's talk about how these things compare in terms of technicalities. And technicalities is a vague term, but we'll try to give it a bit of definition, and we'll just start by doing the general rankings. I think I'll probably put the Kato up top. Let's leave FH3 there, Legacy 4 there, and we'll probably leave the Midnight down there at the bottom. Yeah, so let's talk about how these things compare. So the reason I put the Kato up here is honestly just like both the bass and the treble have a really nice, satisfying incisiveness to them. Let's focus specifically on the bass. I mentioned it's got the most mid-bass body to it, and that gives it the strongest physicality to the bass. It makes it, frankly, a lot of fun to listen to, whereas, you know, these sets all do different things in terms of the sub bass. Sub bass is decent here, but frankly, a lot of music actually doesn't have that much sub bass in it. So depending on what you're listening to, you might not get the fun in the bass that these provide. Whereas the Kato, I feel like it's just kind of always pretty present. Not that it's an overly bassy set. I really don't think it is, but the bass body on this thing is really just pretty phenomenal. And then again, that treble definition, that treble incisiveness, I find really quite satisfying, very natural sounding, never really untoward at all. You know, I'd say the only downside here on the Kato in terms of technicalities is I think mid-range texture is maybe a bit lacking, but generally pretty impressive on this set. Now, next up, I would say is the File FH3. This has my favorite sub bass tuning of the bunch, right? Again, they all have kind of different versions of that bass tuning, but if you're looking for a sub bassy set, this is still one of my favorites. It's got a nice sense of rumble to it, but it doesn't sacrifice clean separation of the mid-range. It's still got a nice sense of texture and micro contrast in the mid-range, which you might think gets sacrificed from bass because most of the others do, but the FH3 actually does it pretty well. I would say that the treble is maybe a little bit on the plasticky side, and that would be its downside, but generally really happy with it. I would also say this has a nice wide staging presentation to it. Again, I don't usually put a lot of stock into soundstage and stuff, especially with IEMs. And I don't know, it's not usually a priority for me, but when comparing them here, this is the one that actually is pretty extra engaging because of that. Next up, I would say the SeeAudio Legacy 4. I would say the downside here is the plastic can be a little bit trebly. No, the treble can be a little bit on the plasticky side. It's a little bit smoother than the treble, I would say, on the FH3, but it still comes across maybe lacking a little bit in texture. But otherwise, I don't know, it's generally, this is actually a pretty boring set. But it's well executed, right? Again, the bass is sub-bass focus. It's not the most rumbly, it's not the hardest hitting or anything like that, but it's really pretty tight and well executed if that's your tuning preference. The mid-range, I think, actually has a pretty good sense of texture and probably the most transparency in terms of the mid-range, and a lot of that comes from the tuning. But yeah, that's why I would put that here. And then the Yume Midnight, I think, again, its strengths are in that treble extension and in that sub bass, which it does really, really well. But unfortunately for me, I found that the mid-range is just kind of so overly smoothed over that it, for me, pretty significantly detracts from the technical performance here. And now finally, let's rank these things in terms of form factor. And for the most part, there's not a whole lot of difference between these, but I will say that the Legacy 4 is pretty clearly my favorite in terms of form factor. Let's see, we'll put that one up top. I'd say, I don't know, these are both kind of tied, and the Midnight maybe slightly behind, which we'll talk about why. So the Legacy 4, if you haven't heard me gush about this before, the design, the fit, at least for my ears, is amongst the best fitting IEMs out there in the world. Just fits very securely, plugs in nice and easily. I give this thing 10 stars out of 10 stars for ergonomics. Not that I have 10 stars to give away, but love the fit on that. The Kato, oh, I guess maybe anything else to talk about? I guess the aesthetics on this thing are maybe not my favorite. That's fine. And you might notice I don't have the stock cable on it. Not because the stock cable is a problem. It just, I don't know, I kind of like this thinner cable. The Kato, on the other hand, I think build quality, form factor, and stuff like that, they really knocked it out of the park with this thing. For 200 bucks, like the quality that you get, they've got a nice hefty feel to them. The stock cable is beautiful. It behaves quite well. My only quibble with these is they don't fit quite as securely as something like this. Well, they don't, I shouldn't say quite as secure. This is, again, top tier fit. I would say this is pretty average fit, especially with single dynamic driver earphones. I tend to struggle a little bit with the fit security, which just means that, you know, wearing them for 30 minutes, 60 minutes at a time, they'll start to come loose a little bit and they require a little bit of fiddling. I found that with the Kato, but frankly, I also found that a little bit with the FH3. Although the FH3 did improve when I added, as you might see, I've got Moondrop spring tips on it because I am a spring tip shill. Otherwise, what can I say about the FH3? It's pretty standard fitting IEM, a little bit, I would say moderately sized. If you've got small ears, I think this would actually be pretty well fit for you. Again, you might notice I don't have the stock cable on here because the stock cable that came on my FH3 was pretty springy and annoying. But there you go. And then finally, I will leave the Yume Midnight, which, again, I think it's aesthetically pretty handsome. I think the cable is nice and serviceable. Really no complaints there. And the fit security is actually pretty good for me. The biggest issues that I have with this is just that seal creates just kind of an uncomfortable pressure buildup. And because that was affecting the sound, it meant that this is actually surprisingly fiddly for me to fit on my ear. So because of that, I'm just gonna have to leave it down here at the bottom. But I think that just about does it for my thoughts here on, let me pull it up alongside my head. That just about does it for my thoughts here on the SeeAudio Yume Midnight. Yeah, honestly, overall, not a bad set. And I do think this is actually a pretty noticeable improvement over the original Yume. The original Yume, again, I say I like a neutral sound signature. It is dead neutral. I found it just really quite boring. Whereas the Midnight, definitely, it's not a boring set. It's got that sub-bass character to it. Or sorry, it's got that sub-bass quality to it. Gives it that depth. It's got that upper treble. it's got some fun and some engagement, but the mid-range, unfortunately, I do find pretty lacking here on it. And then again, the issues that I have with the fit, kind of a detractor for me. So out of 5 stars, I'm gonna give SeeAudio Crinacle Yume Midnight 3 stars. Not a bad set. And if you're interested in checking it out, I do have links in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you found this video helpful, despite my technical issues in the middle of it, please hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Ding the YouTube bell. And I guess I'll catch you on the next super review. Otherwise, if you're here now live, hang around and let's have a little chat while I figure out my connection issues with my monitor.